faithful, make sure that.
All right. We are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all once again for being here. Greatly appreciate it. Super excited for today's session. This is I would say a much needed session for sure. Because there's so much I say a lack of education around, what to do, when a loved one or someone or yourself passes on when you're about to transition. Like there's so many things that we should be doing ahead of time so that we don't leave our families with burdens, right? We talk about legacy, and this is a part of building a legacy, right? Leaving things behind and setting things in place so that we don't, leave behind a mess whenever we transition. So I'm super excited to have brother Cody McCain here with us today. He is a funeral director in Burke County. He's the owner of McCain Funeral Home and Cremations. So super excited to have him. I have a short bio here that I'm gonna just briefly read, and then I'll turn things over to Cody to jump right into his presentation. So again, we're honored to have him today. He is a dedicated funeral director, an embalmer, and a legacy planner whose journey into the funeral service began at a very young age, I believe around the age of 4, from hosting backyard funerals for animals as a child to becoming the proud owner of McCain Funeral Home and Cremations. Cody's calling has been undeniable, and with deep faith, years of experience, and a heart for serving families with dignity and compassion, Cody has become a trusted expert in the field. So he has many years of experience in this field. So super excited to have you, Cody. I'm just gonna basically turn it over to you and let you dive in however you see fit. So thank you again for being here, and the floor is yours.
But first, I'd like to say good evening to everyone that is on uh, the call. I first of all want to apologize. I was having some technical difficulties. One thing I try to tell people is when you're in funeral business, it can go from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds. And so whenever you need stuff, you can't find it. But then whenever you don't need it, that's what seems like that's when things pop up. So what I'm going to have to do, I'm going to be presenting, but my slideshow would not pull up. But if you please send your email addresses in the chat, I will send over the slides to you so that you can review them at your leisure. But along the way, if you do have any questions about any of the material that I'm presenting, don't hesitate to ask. But what I want to really cover, um, try to do a surmised version of what it means to pre-plan. Now, there are a lot of uh, myths when it comes to pre-planning funerals. I do know, in more specifically in our culture, as many times as Black people, we consider it a taboo to talk about pre-planning because some people are under the impression if you talk about that, that means you're going to die. Well, we all going to die one day. Everybody is going to leave from here one day. And so it is imperative that we have some things in place before that time comes, because it relieves the stress from your family. There are countless times when I see families come in that are unprepared, and what should be a 45 to 1 hour arrangement conference can sometimes turn into 4 and 5 hours because families do not have things in place. They don't know where anything is. They didn't know what mama's wishes were. They didn't know what daddy's wishes were. There is no insurance or any other type of funding. So it causes a lot of stress on families. So I want to cover what it means to pre plan, the types of pre planning that you can do, the funding mechanisms that are used for pre planning funerals, and just some common ethical and uh, lawful matters to keep in mind when you're dealing with a funeral provider.
Hey,
So
hey, Cody,
go
really
ahead.
quick before you dive right in, if you want, you can send your presentation to me, and I could share my screen for you. Um,
Okay.
and I can that way we can navigate it that way.
Okay. We'll do that. Just a second. What's your email?
James Setzer LR@gmail.com.
Okay. Just a second. Okay. It should be coming right at you.
Okay.
Okay. Just let me know once you get it.
That's it. And you sent it. Oh, okay, I got it. Okay, I see it. All
Yeah.
right. Yes, sir. Let's see. All right, 1 second. And I'll share my screen right now. Okay. Share.
Mm.
Um, Here we go. Let me just share PowerPoint. All right.
Okay. All right. And if you go to that number 4 slide that says hypothetical scenario, there we go. And hit the arrow. There we go. So I like to always give some scenarios that are based off of real life experiences that I've had. This scenario says Miss Smith develops a sudden illness and passes away. She leaves behind 10 children, each of who are responsible for making funeral arrangements. 8 of the 10 children come to the funeral home and spend over 4 hours coming to a consensus on what Mrs. Smith's final plan should be. Could this have been avoided? Absolutely. You go to the next scenario. Scenario number 2. So scenario number 2 says Mr. Jones has a father in hospice care. His intentions was to prearrange his father's services, but assumed he could not afford it. So he decided not to do so. Mr. Jones's father passes away 4 months earlier than anticipated, and no final wishes were in place. Could this have been avoided? Absolutely. So, which brings us to what I like to call on the next slide the top 8 myths of pre planning a funeral. Myth number 1, it's too hard to talk about. Myth number 2, there's no use talking about death now when it's so far in the future. These are actual comments and responses I've heard from people. Myth number 3, my loved one doesn't need to pre plan his or her funeral because they're financially secure. That may be true, but again, if there aren't other elements that revolve around the actual funeral process itself in place, it can still be tedious. Number 4, the family already knows if he or she prefers burial or cremation. This is something I encounter all the time. There are countless times where even when I'm on services, people will come up to me and say, well, Mr. McCain, when I die, I want to be cremated, or when I die, I want a funeral just like this, and I want to be buried at such and such cemetery. And my my verbatim response to them all the time is come and put it on paper. Because many times families will say, well, I think mama wanted this, I think daddy wanted that, but there's nothing on paper to validate that. Myth number 5. And I've heard people say this, I'll be gone, so it doesn't matter. Well, that's a very selfish mindset to have whenever your family has to be the one to plan your services. But these are actual responses I've heard over the years. Myth number 6. Uh, the person already has cemetery property or a plot. That's only maybe 30% of the whole. The other 70%, hinges upon what's done in the arrangement room with a funeral director. Number 7, it doesn't make sense to plan now when, he or she doesn't know where they'll be living in the future. A lot of people don't know that pre-needs are transferable, and I'll get to that later. And then perhaps the greatest myth that I hear all of the time, I can afford it. And so what I always tell people when it comes to pre-need, you have the flexibility and the liberty to plan according to what your budget is. That is the one of the greatest benefits of pre-need. You can plan according to what you want your budget to be as far as your final wishes. So I want to go to the next slide, the definition of a prearranged or pre-planned funeral. Now, there are differences. Sometimes we use these terms interchangeably, but there's a difference from what is called a prearranged or pre-planned funeral and a pre-need. There is a difference. A prearranged funeral or pre-planned funeral is one in which details such as the order of service, merchandise, and the mode of final disposition, whether it be burial or cremation, is documented. So that's where you come in, you sit down with your funeral director, you plan out everything. But notice what I did not mention when it comes to a prearrangement or a pre-planned funeral. I did not mention finances. With a prearrangement or a pre-plan, there is no funding mechanism that's put in place for that. You basically came in, said what you wanted, but there's nothing there financially to pay for it. Which brings me to the next slide. The definition of a pre-need. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the main difference is the same thing as a prearrangement, except with pre-need, there is the conversation of finances. What is going to be used to pay for your funeral plans? Whether that's an insurance policy, whether that's a trust account, whatever that mechanism may be. Pre-need has to do with the financial aspect. Pre-arrangement, that's just, you said what your plans were. With pre-need, it incorporates both. The reason why I have to drive this point home, I have encountered many families that have come in over the years. The person that passed away may have had a pre-arrangement, but families, not knowing the difference, they say, oh, well, yeah, mama came in and took care of everything. Everything's taken care of. No, it's not. All mama did was come in, pick out what kind of casket she wanted, what kind of vault she wanted, what kind of service she'd like, and it was written down and documented. But there was nothing in place financially to pay for that. And so over the years, it's left a lot of sticker shock with families when they didn't know the difference between a pre-need and a pre-arrangement. So it's important to know. So we're going to go to the next slide. I want to emphasize this piece. One entity that we're governed by in the practice of funeral service is the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission has very strict stipulations and regulations on how we are to conduct our business. And so there's a particular rule from the Federal Trade Commission called the Funeral Rule of 1984. And this applies to both pre-need and at-need funeral arrangements. When I say at-need, that means at the time of death. So this rule governs how funeral practitioners, such as myself, how we represent pricing to the public, how we represent goods and services to the public and to the consumer. So I want to go over some specific Federal Trade Commission rules that a lot of consumers are not aware of whenever you're dealing with a funeral home. And whether this is pre-need or at need, you can go to the next slide. Whether it's pre-need or at need, these rules apply. Number one, you must be given a general price list upon request or when discussing goods and services with a funeral home. You have the right to go to any funeral home anywhere and say, hey, I want a copy of your general price list to see how much your services are. And by law, we are required to give you a general price list. When you come in to discuss pre-need with a funeral director to pre-plan your arrangements, we are required to show you a general price list. Whenever you are dealing with a funeral director at need, when someone passes away and you go to the funeral home to make arrangements, before we begin to go over what's on that bill, we're required to give you a general price list so that you'll know what our charges are. And what they're trying to do, it hasn't passed yet, but they're trying to extend this rule to require funeral homes to post their general price lists on their websites, which I have no problem with. I think it's a great idea. But you are required to have a general price list. No funeral home can tell you that they can't give you one. And if a funeral home does tell you that they can't give you one, that's a red flag. You can go to the next point. Number two, you must be given an itemized statement of goods and services when doing a pre-need or at need. So a funeral director just can't, come in and say, okay, you pick out this casket, you pick out this, and just give you a bottom line price. All right, everything gonna be $69.95. And you don't see any type of itemized statement which the funeral director has to sign and you have to sign, and you retain a copy of. You must be shown an itemized statement, which is your itemized bill from the funeral home. So that way, everything that's on that itemized statement should line up with what's on that general price list and a couple of other price lists, which I'll show you in just a moment. But you must be given an itemized statement. Next thing, a lot of people don't know this. You must give verbal or written authorization for embalming, and you must be shown the necessary disclosure. Embalming is not required by law. I repeat, embalming is not required by law except in certain circumstances, such as when a deceased is being shipped on a common carrier, such as an airline. Most airlines require a body to be embalmed before it's loaded onto their cargo hold and shipped. But as far as in any normal circumstance, embalming is not required. Now, it's recommended if you plan on having a public viewing where remains are open to the public and the public is going to be, um, interacting with them. Embalming is recommended for health and sanitary purposes, but is not a requirement. So we can't just go pick up a deceased and embalm without permission. That's a violation of this rule. I actually had a family I dealt with not too long ago that had dealt with another funeral home before they switched over to a funeral home I was helping, and I asked them, I said, "Well, did you give permission for embalming?" Because the director charged them for it, but they don't remember asking for it. I said, "Well, were you given any type of authorization form to sign, giving him permission to embalm?" And they said no, which is a clear violation of this rule. You can go to the next thing. Number four, you must be shown. This goes to when I mentioned, there are a couple other price lists that you have to be shown. You must be shown a casket and out of burial container price list when discussing merchandise with a funeral director. So everything that's on your itemized bill should match up with what's on that general price list, and it should match up with what's on the casket price list and your out of burial container price list. When I say out of burial container, I mean either a vault or a grave liner that many cemeteries do require sometimes. But you have to be shown these price lists. The next thing, again, such as we have a disclosure for embalming, you must be shown the necessary disclosure for out of barrel containers, because a lot of people believe that you have to have a vault. You don't have to have a vault if the cemetery does not require one. You don't have to have any type of out of barrel container unless the cemetery requires it. Many private family owned cemeteries and many church cemeteries don't require out of container, but most perpetual care cemeteries do. When I say perpetual care, meaning they're governed by a city, a city entity or a private company, and they're constantly upkept. That's what's known as perpetual care. Most of those cemeteries require some type of out of burial container. So it's not required otherwise, but it is recommended to keep the ground from caving in on the casket over time and causing a big sinkhole in the grave. The next thing, and I have to drive this home because this is something that I've seen too many times in our practice. And I've underlined it and put it in bold letters. Only a licensed funeral practitioner or a registered apprentice operating under the license of a funeral practitioner has the authority to discuss prices of goods and services with you. In other words, if Mr. Joe Blow, who works at XYZ Funeral Home and has been working at XYZ Funeral Home for 50 years, but he's neither an apprentice under a funeral director nor the licensed funeral director, but he comes and tells you, hey, our funeral home can do everything for $49.95. Well, Mr. Joe Blow is in the wrong because he doesn't have a license to be discussing those things. So anytime you're discussing prices, and even with an apprentice, if it's an apprentice, it has to be at the funeral home with the funeral director present to discuss those things. But only a licensed funeral director, if you see a licensed funeral director in the public or anything like that, and you ask about prices, he or she can give you that information. If they don't hold a license, they cannot give you that information. Even if you call a funeral home, the only person that's able to discuss prices with you over the phone is a licensed funeral director. No one else can do that, because what I've seen too many times over the years, you have individuals that work at funeral homes, but they don't have a license, and they're going around quoting prices to consumers and saying, "Oh, we can beat that price. We could do it for $39.95 and do this and do that." That's something that is not supposed to happen. So, and that even falls into pre-need. Only a licensed pre-need establishment and a pre-need sales licensee has the authority to discuss items pertaining to pre-planning. So when you go to a funeral home and you're talking pre-need, and pre-need, of course, involves money, only a licensed pre-need establishment can write a pre-need. If that funeral home does not have a licensed pre-need establishment permit, they cannot take your money ahead of time. They cannot deposit it into any type of trust account or insurance policy because they don't have the necessary credentials to do so. And I drive that home because there have been funeral homes that I've seen to try to get people to go ahead and even where some try to go around that, even if a consumer is not physically giving the funeral home money or writing a check or anything like that, even if you make the funeral home the beneficiary on an insurance policy, or if you assign the funeral home as an assignee on an insurance policy, guess what? That's considered pre-need in the eyes of the law. So if a funeral home tries to get you to do that and they don't have a pre-need establishment license, they're in violation. Because I've seen this happen before. So we can go to the next slide. I want to give people information about the North Carolina Board of Funeral Service. That's who governs our practice in the state of North Carolina, the North Carolina Board of Funeral Service. You as the consumer have the right and you have the ability to go on this website, ncbfs.org, and you can actually look up to make sure that the funeral home that you're dealing with is a licensed establishment, that the funeral home you're dealing with is a licensed pre-need establishment, and even the funeral director that you're talking to, that they are licensed, that they are a licensee in this state. You could go on there and look up that information under the look up verify license section, and it's pretty easy to navigate through. I'm not going to go through all of that in detail, but if you go on their website, you have the right to look up that information just to make sure that who you're dealing with is in fact properly credentialed. Okay. So I'm going to skip down to slide number 15. How pre-need funeral arrangements are commonly funded. So these are some of the common mechanisms for pre-need funeral. Number one, an insurance policy. And I kind of touched on it a moment ago. Some people that have existing, I actually did this for a customer just maybe about an hour ago. She had an existing insurance policy and she wanted to use that to fund her pre-need. So what we did, I had her sign what's called a collateral assignment form, which we'll send to the insurance company that assigns that policy to the funeral home. So at the time of her death, they would pay us what we billed them, and then the remaining amount would go to her named beneficiary on the policy. So the most common type of mechanism to fund a pre-need is an insurance policy, whether it's whole life, which of course whole life meaning from the time it's issued until the time you pass away. Usually, most whole life policies endow at age 99. You're covered. Term life, term life, and I'm not going to go in too much. I'll answer any questions about it, but because I do write insurance, but not to avoid going into too much with the insurance. But whole life that covers you from the time you take it out to the time you pass away. Term life is what it is. Term life is only for a specific term, whether it's 10-year, 20-year, 30-year. At the end of that term, that's it. So when the term is up, policies, null and void. Term policies do not build any kind of cash value like whole life policies do. So once the term is up, there's no cash value in it. You can't get anything out of it. A lot of times people get term, because it's cheaper and you can get bigger quantities of it for a cheaper price. And it's good to have in certain scenarios. But again, it's not permanent. And then burial or final expense insurance. That's another type of whole life policy, which is specifically catered to and geared towards final expenses or burial expenses. The next commonly used funding mechanism is a trust account. Now, a lot of funeral homes have moved away from trust accounts simply because they don't have a high rate of growth. I personally don't use trust accounts for that reason. And most banks don't even do pre-need trust accounts anymore. The only bank that I'm pretty familiar with here in North Carolina that still does pre-need trust accounts is First Citizens. That's about the only one that still does them. I only had two First Citizens trust accounts, and the only reason I had them was because both of the individuals that came to do a pre-need were over 100 years old at the time. Well, both of them passed away in 2024, so I no longer have trust accounts. All the rest of them are insurance funded. So a trust account was at one time a common way until insurance came about as far as a funding mechanism. And then the last method, still related to insurance, is what's called a single premium insurance payment. So that's basically where if you went to a funeral home and your total for your funeral came up to $7,500. Well, you write the funeral home a check for $7,500. We take that money. We first have to put it in what's called a pre-need clearing account. We can't put it in our general funds. It has to go in a separate account. Once the check clears, we then issue that check to whatever pre-need insurance company that we use. So it depends on the funeral home. I know here at our establishment, there are two main pre-need insurance companies I use, which is National Guardian Life and Homesteaders Life. Those are the two pre-need insurance companies that I use. So that takes the place of a trust account, whereas money used to be deposited into a trust account at a bank, a single premium payment for an insurance policy, get you the same thing, but it gets you a higher rate of growth to cover the cost of inflation. As years go by and the prices of goods and services go up, that insurance policy with a higher rate of growth will keep up with that inflation. You go to the next slide. So you have two types of pre-need contracts. You have what are known as a standard contract. So whether it be standard trust funded or standard insurance funded, it's a standard contract. So the difference between a standard contract, and you can go to the next slide so I can show you the next type of contract, which is inflation proof. The difference between a standard contract and inflation proof. Inflation proof is what it sounds like. It pretty much protects your funeral costs from the effects of inflation. So that way, if 10, 20 years from now, then a death occurs, it keeps your family from having to pay, a huge amount of money out of pocket, because the prices of things have gone up. So inflation proof does that. Standard does not. So most funeral homes, I do both. I normally do a standard contract if, again, I've given them an insurance product that has a high rate of growth. I normally do an inflation proof contract if someone, like the lady I dealt with earlier, if she's assigning a policy to me, there's already just a fixed amount that the death benefit's going to be. It's never going to go up. So I do an inflation proof contract to protect them from, the rising cost of goods. So those are the two types of pre-need contracts. Now, you go to the next slide. This is that goods and services document that I mentioned earlier. Now, this is what it looks like on a pre-need basis. This is what is known as a pre-need statement of goods and services. So all of those little line items there is what is itemized when it comes to the cost of a funeral. And everything on there should line up with, again, what you've seen on that funeral home's general price list and what you've seen on their outer burial container price list and casket price list. Next slide. Now, with both inflation proof and standard contracts, they can either be revocable or irrevocable. Revocable is generally better for the consumer because, meaning you can, if you have buyer's remorse or you decide you don't want it, you can cancel the contract at any time. Irrevocable, you cannot. Irrevocable, if you're going to try to cancel an irrevocable contract in the state of North Carolina, you have to obtain a court order. So someone will ask, well, why would you do an irrevocable contract then? Many times, irrevocable contracts are required by the Department of Social Services in certain situations if an individual is getting ready to go into a facility so that they don't lose their Medicaid benefits. They have to do what's called a spin down. So many times they have to take that money and come and put it into a pre-need plan. And they require those particular type of contracts to be irrevocable so that that individual doesn't lose their Medicaid benefits. Now, contracts that are irrevocable can be transferred to another funeral establishment. Standard contracts can be transferred to another funeral establishment. I emphasize that because a lot of times I've encountered this. People will say, well, mama had this, pre-need at such and such funeral home, so that's where we're going to go. Even if that's not necessarily what they would like, a lot of times they will elect to do that because they feel like they're obligated to. A lot of people don't know pre-need contracts can be transferred from one pre-need establishment to another before or at the time of death. So if you have a contract at ABC Funeral Home that mama had, but when she passes away, you decide you want to go to XYZ Funeral Home instead. Well, ABC Funeral Home can transfer that contract to XYZ Funeral Home. And it's just a matter of a request to be given. We decided to go with XYZ Funeral Home. Can you please transfer mama's information over to them? And they have to do that. So, next slide. So how do you go from pre-need to at-need? So whenever, if you do have a pre-need uh, plan at a funeral home and the person passes away, what happens whenever it then becomes an at-need case? Number one, you have your consultation with your funeral director, whichever funeral home you choose. You're given an at-need statement of goods and services. So you have your pre-need statement. You also are given an at-need statement, which you're required to sign, and the funeral director is required to sign. Then there's the disbursement of the funds from that pre-need, whether it's the insurance policy, the trust account, whatever was used to fund that pre-need, the funds are dispersed. Now, in the state of North Carolina, if there is an excess of pre-need funds, so if the funeral bill came up to $10,000, but in the pre-need there was $12,000, that means there's an excess of $2,000 there. By law, if it's an amount equal to or greater than $1,000 in the state of North Carolina, we are required by a North Carolina general statute to deposit that money into the estate of the decedent. We cannot give that money back to the family directly. It has to go to the estate. And that's a requirement. It is a statute in North Carolina. And anything under $1,000, the funeral home can disperse those funds directly to the family. But anything 1,000 and up, we have to give that to the estate. So we have to take that to the clerk of court in whatever county that person passed away in. Okay. Next thing. Next slide there. Another factor I want to throw in there, I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but I want to emphasize it some more because, again, this is something that I've encountered too many times in my experience. All licensees of the board, I'm going to read this just a little bit. All licensees of the board, meaning the Board of Funeral Service, must comply with the following in order to avoid committing solicitation as prohibited. In other words, a funeral director cannot call a family and solicit their services. We cannot do that. No one at the time of death should ring your phone, Facebook you, text you offering their services. That's called solicitation. We are required to wait for families to contact us. We cannot. Now, if a family member reaches out and requests a call back, that's different. But as soon as someone passes away, we can't just come knocking on your door, calling your phone, say, hey, I'm with XYZ Funeral Home, just, if you need us, give us a call. We can, we can service you. We can't do that. That is something we are prohibited from doing. Okay. So next slide. And that just gives and you can, again, if you send me your email, I can email the slideshow to you. That's just some more language, given more specifics on what solicitation means. And that's even for pre-need, because I had a situation about a year or so ago where a lady wanted to come and do a pre-need with me, but there was an individual from another funeral home that started giving her conflicting information, and this individual does not hold a license. So she began to ask me about it. And I flat out told her, I said, well, ma'am, that individual doesn't have a license, so he shouldn't be talking to you about that. And it just blew her mind. She said, really? He's not supposed to? I said, no, ma'am. He does not have a pre-need license. He's not a licensed funeral director. He can't talk to you about that. So that's why I drive this point home, because you want to make sure who you're dealing with is properly credentialed and educated in this. Okay. Now, I already jumped ahead, but I'll just reiterate it again. Pre-needs are transferable before or after the death of the pre-need contract holder. And I emphasize that because, again, I ran into a situation 2 years ago where a family wanted to transfer a pre-need from, one establishment to my establishment. And I told them what to do, by law, according to the statute. I said, well, what you need to do, you need to give them a written request stating what you want to do. That's all you have to do. You give that funeral home a written request saying, "Hey, I want to transfer this contract over to whatever funeral home." And so they did that. Whether you go take it to them in person, mail, email, as long as it's a written request. Well, they emailed that funeral home and copied me in it. That funeral home refused to transfer the contract. They blatantly refused to transfer the contract. And to make a long story short, they were reported to the North Carolina Board of Funeral Service and they got in trouble for that. They got in trouble for that. A funeral home cannot refuse to transfer a contract to another funeral home. Cannot happen. Okay. So the next thing, and I always want to discuss this as well, there is what's called a pre-need recovery fund that the North Carolina Board of Funeral Service has in place. Anytime you do a pre-need with a funeral home, we're going to assess a fee of $20. That fee does not go to the funeral home; it goes to the North Carolina Board of Funeral Service to file your pre-need contract. 10 of the $20 goes into this recovery fund. This recovery fund functions similar to how the FDIC functions when covering bank accounts. So if in the event the funeral home that you took out a pre-need with goes under, something happens, it goes out of business, it's shut down. When your pre-need is on file with the state board, that protects your funds. So your funds are not lost because we have the recovery fund for that. And I've seen where that has happened, where establishments have closed, and the recovery fund had to, protect or had to, disperse out funds to reimburse the consumer for their pre-need funds. So your pre-need funds are protected through the recovery fund, which is why we're required to file it with the North Carolina Board of Funeral Service. Okay, so at the last slide, I now open it up for any questions. I know that was quite a bit of information. I tried to get through it as concisely as I can to not take up too much time, but I'll entertain any questions that you may have about this or about anything related to practice of funeral service, what to expect, something you did not know, or something that you were too afraid to ask. I welcome and entertain any questions at this time.
All right. Sorry about that. Had a hard time coming off of mute. First and foremost, man, listen, a lot of great information. That was very, very, very informative. Like yeah, I gotta go back and rewatch this maybe a couple times, take some more notes, but a lot of beneficial information for sure. So I'll start with the first question, while others think of things that they may ask, just to kind of break the ice. I know one of the touchy subjects, as you mentioned, is around finances. So I'm just curious if you can share like what the average funeral costs normally are, like based on what you see
Mhm.
typically.
Your average funeral cost to date, 2025, your average funeral cost is
Mm,
going to be anywhere, and this is just average. When I say average, the average is across the country. Your averages are going to be anywhere from $8,000 to $10,000 on
mm,
average. So, of course, depending on which funeral home you go to, sometimes it could be more, sometimes it could be less. It also depends upon the services you select and the merchandise you select. But on average, it usually falls between $8,000 to $10,000.
gotcha. No, that's extremely beneficial. I know my papa had actually touched on that on Sunday, if I'm not mistaken. So it's spot on
Yeah.
for sure. Another question. I don't see any hands right now. Remember, everyone, you can um, hit the reaction button and click raise hand, and then we can unmute you so that you can ask a question, or you can post your question here in the chat. All right. So another question. So, um, around that same lane, around the cost. So what typically like drives up the cost of a funeral?
Okay.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
is it the casket, or I mean, Like what goes into
It
that?
it depends, and usually what drives up the cost of a funeral is the merchandise. So that depends on the type of casket you may select, the type of out of burial container you may select. Um, you know, your funeral home would show you the selection that they offer, and so every funeral home is different as far as how they price their merchandise. So usually those are the common items. Also, um, certain aspects of services, such as if you get a family car, if you get a tribute video, if you want certain other aspects of a service, those things tend to drive up costs. And then also a lot of times, what can drive up costs are the cash advance items. What I mean by cash advances, those are items that go on the bill that funeral home actually has to pay out to those other vendors. So, such as death certificates, those are $10 a piece in the state of North Carolina. That's a cash advance. Sometimes funeral homes want, or sometimes families want to put the cost of a plot, if they don't have one, on a cash advance section of the bill so that they can use their insurance or whatever to pay for it. So those are some of the common items that tend to drive up the cost of a funeral.
I appreciate that. Very insightful. All right. So we have a question or a comment by Apostle or Lady Misty. If you wanna, you should be unmuted at this point.
Okay. Yes. Now, suppose uh, a person has purchased or a pre-need. They've already paid for a pre-need and picked the specific casket they want. Let's say, suppose this happened in 2005. This person's death occurs in 2025. Now, would they still get that Pacific casket, or knowing the price has already gone up on that casket, or would they get one similar to that casket of the price that they've paid?
Very, very, very good question, sir. And I have actually encountered that quite a few times, because just like cars, caskets, the models change.
That's right.
Models change, the designs change. So there are units that may have been around 20, 25 years ago that are no longer sold.
Mhm.
But what we are required to do, and what we should do, ethical thing to do, is to offer a comparable unit and a comparable price of the unit.
Okay.
What I normally do is, if I see a unit that was around 20 years ago, I say, well, I tell you what, this unit is similar to that, and we'll honor, that price, since that unit is no longer available. So that's something that we're required and should do, is to offer you a comparable unit and a comparable price of that unit.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great question, Papa. Misty, did you have any question? Okay, all right. And Papa, I know you've had a lot of years of experience in the industry. Any additional comments based on what Mr. Cody has shared?
Man, it's superb information. Superb. On point. Spirit of thank you.
Yes,
Amen,
sir.
amen, amen. Appreciate that. All right, I see Minister Summersell. I'm coming to you, sir. 1 second. Let me get you unmuted. All right. You should have a request to unmute yourself. There you go.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
That was a whole lot of information and a very small amount of time. I enjoyed that information, sir. I, I could tell you that you could hear from my accent. I'm not an American, and so, like you said earlier, there has always been a taboo about pre-planning.
Yes.
And it's only recently, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I started making plans for me, concerning me. Um, it was because of my pastor that I know about insurance and planning. My first wife passed in 2007. Maybe 4 or 5 years before she passed, the pastor at the end of the service had somebody to speak to us about insurance. The very next week, I took out insurance for my family and I, and it was 5 years later that my wife passed. I could tell you
Wow.
what, sir, there was no headache in planning
Right.
for my wife because I had this stuff in place. All I had to do was take that insurance. I gave it to my pastor. We went to the funeral home. It didn't take more than 45 minutes to
Right.
put
Right.
what we needed on paper. But I promise you, sir, this information is well needed for especially our people. Thank
Yes,
you
sir.
again. Thank you,
Yes.
thank you, thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Appreciate that, Minister Somerset. Very, very insightful, sir. Very insightful. All right, all right. Let's see. Gerard, I saw you also had your hand up. Did you have a question?
More so just a comment, just saying thank you guys for putting it together. As the last gentleman just said, like there's a common misconception of being prepared and oh, that's not what we do. But then you're waiting whenever somebody does pass, you're trying to do a fish fry or something to raise money when you could have done something more
Oh,
to be able to prevent. My mom's husband had passed and they didn't have a life insurance policy or anything. So I'm like, well, what are we gonna do? So now we're just scrambling. And I was like, well, and then I had a conversation with my mom. I'm like, well, we're not going through this with me or you. So I have a life insurance policy, but I don't have a kid or anything. Just just thank you for sharing this and just this will be able to go out to other people
and
and they can be prepared.
yes. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that because I've encountered that more times than I would like to when families, come in and they don't have anything. They're not prepared. And still want all the bells and whistles
Hmm.
of a funeral. All of the bells and whistles and the pomp and circumstance that comes with a funeral, but they don't have the finances. And I'm the type of funeral director, you know, in so many words, I'm going to tell you, you need to do what you can afford.
Mhm.
If you can't afford a $12,000 funeral, then you don't need to be having a $12,000 funeral. You might need to you consider cremation. If
Mhm.
that's within your budget.
I won't
And I
say
tell
that word.
people,
Don't say those
we
words.
don't say that word. A lot of
That's a
times we don't
fact.
want to mention the C word in our culture. But I try to put people at ease. Say, you can still have a funeral and still do cremation, and it cuts the cost down. In something more in your range. But I encounter families all the time that, they come in the first, and I hate to say it, but amongst our folks,
Mhm.
the first thing they want to ask, knowing they don't have it, they want all the bells and whistles, y'all got a payment plan. And the answer is no. It's called you have to plan to pay.
Hmm.
Because I tried doing that before a long time ago, and it doesn't work. It's not effective because you might have some folks, they might make one or two payments, and then when they see you in the grocery store, they kind of ducking you, and they
Hmm.
kind of it's not effective. And I try to do a win-win for everyone. Hey, I want you to stay in the range that you can afford, because at the end of the day, one, you'll have the peace of mind and not have the stress, the financial burden, because you're in a range that you can afford. And I'll have peace of mind because I know I'm gonna be able to pay my light bill.
Mhm.
I'll be able to take care of my staff because it's a win-win. It's a win-win for everyone. But there are situations where I've had to, families have had to, do fish fries, do GoFundMe's, raise money, simply because they they don't have, things in place. So yes.
Yes, thanks for sharing.
Appreciate that, Gerard. Man, yeah, very, very insightful. Again, I'm sure you encounter a lot just hearing
Oh,
a tidbit piece of that.
oh,
uh, so could you maybe touch on just like for someone who, as you said, let's say they didn't have the budget to afford like a normal or average funeral, and they needed to go the cremation route, like what would that normally or typically cost in 2025?
Your average cremation, if you're doing just a direct cremation, what we call it, which is just cremation, no type of service or anything. Your average direct cremation cost in 2025 is about $1,000 on average. Some places may be more, some places may be less, but that's about the average. And then, of course, with cremation, you have, more options with that now. You can do cremation with a memorial service, where you just have the urn present. And then I've done quite a few funeral services with cremations where, functions just like a funeral. The body's embalmed, dressed, casketed, laid out in a rental casket that we use for cremation. Services at, here at the funeral home or at a church or wherever they worship, and cremation to follow. So there are more options with, cremation now to kind of sort of, I guess, take the finality out of it, where it's just like, oh, they just, they're gone. But, that it tends to be the more affordable route for those that, may not have the means.
Gotcha. Yep. I appreciate that. That's helpful. All right. All right. Do you? Hold on 1 second. My wife has a question.
Sure.
Hi, Cody. First of all, great job. And I've seen a lot of your services. So I don't know, where it derived from, but just very efficient with everything. And I love the way you exit. You could just see, that you really care about what you do and the services you offer. So just thank you for who you are. And I love when you put your tailcoat over the casket and walk them out. Never seen it done like that before, but that is just you. So I love that. I was wondering if there's any advice or like anything that could be done pertaining to one of those family members that just refuse life insurance because they feel like I'm gonna die if I open up a policy. Are y'all trying to kill me if y'all getting a policy, or want me to get a policy? Is there anything that can be done for that, or would just the straight cremation be the best route?
I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions with that. I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions with that. One, if it's a situation like I just mentioned, where you're looking for the more affordable route, then, more than likely cremation would be your best bet in that sense. But there are situations where if you happen to be privy to that information, because this, in some situations you have to, as long as you, in the law of insurance, as long as you have what is known as an insurable interest in that person, you could take life insurance out on.
Mm. Mm. Okay. Oh, he frozen.
I think we lost you, Cody. 1 second. Let's bear with him.
Guess what? You have an insurable interest. So if you got Uncle Bobo's date of birth and social security number, you can go take a policy out on Uncle Bobo, and Uncle Bobo not know about it.
Yeah.
And when Uncle Bobo passes away, Uncle Bobo could be put away nice.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So, you just have to have an insurable interest there.
Okay. Well, I might need to talk to you. I have an insurable interest.
An insurable interest.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
No, that's beneficial for sure. All right, cool deal. Did you have another question? All right. All right. Any other questions for Brother Cody? Any other questions? This is a safe space. All questions are welcome.
This is a judgment-free zone.
Absolutely. you definitely want to take advantage of this. Like how many times have you seen any platform bring on a funeral director to, give you a chance to ask questions pertaining to your specific situation? Like this is a great opportunity, because as Cody and as Gerard mentioned, like I know I see a lot on Facebook as far as families going the GoFundMe route because they don't have things in place, the fish fry route, just selling whatever, clothes, or selling off things that they would not like to sell off, but they are forced to sell off
or
because
selling items that they shouldn't sell.
facts. That's a fact.
Ain't that happen?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So many things, man. We need to do what we can while we're here to not only prepare for ourselves, but also to help our loved ones, be prepared for their transition as well. That's very important. Minister Somerset, did you have another question as well or a comment?
Yes,
You
yes,
should be
sir.
unmuted. Yep. Okay. Yep. You're unmuted.
Yes, sir. Is that insurable interest? Is that lawful?
Yes, it is. That is the law. I quoted it from the law. If you have an insurable interest in someone, you can get a policy on. That's the key word, insurable interest.
Interest. Okay,
Mhm.
okay, okay, okay. That answers my question. It really does.
Insurable interest.
Okay. One other thing. Like I was saying, when my wife passed, she wanted to be cremated. And so the only thing I had to do was to decide whether or not to have a direct cremation, like you said, or have a service, and then after the service, do the cremation. And that's what we did. I had a service for her, and we did the cremation later. And it also included a spot to put that urn in, as well as a headstone. All of that was included in the arrangement. The apostle saw that all of that was made, and so I didn't have to come back and look for some more finance to take care of that. All of that the insurance covered. All of that was covered.
Awesome.
So this is the same plan that I'm working on for me. And this might sound so funny. I told my wife, I said, honey, you don't have to spend any money, just don't claim the body.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, Minister. That is actually a valid point. In the state of North Carolina, there is a 10-day rule in the state of North Carolina. So if there is someone that chooses not to claim their loved one, like their loved one dies in the hospital, or if they died somewhere else and they're taken to the morgue at the hospital, if they lie unclaimed for 10 days, the Department of Social Services of that county has the right to step in and have them cremated.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Wow.
I don't know if my apostle remembers the very first funeral I went to with him. There was only about 5 or 6 people at the graveside. But up on the hill, there was a whole lot of people. And I don't know if you remember, I asked him, why are they standing up there? He said, family members they didn't claim the body. So they have to stand afar and watch the funeral. Thanks for allowing me to comment.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Minister Somerset. All right, appreciate it, sir. All right, Papa or Misty, one of you had a comment.
Now, at a person's death, if there are not specifics concerning being buried or cremated, and the family is in disarray and they're divided, some Some want the body cremated, others do not want the body cremated. Now, what happens then? Because I've seen where the majority wanted the body cremated, but one person didn't, and it put a monkey wrench in on everything.
Okay, that is a very good question, because we encounter this all the time. So here in the state of North Carolina, we have to follow the order of succession of whoever the next of kin is. So of course, the next of kin order is spouse. If there is no spouse, it's the surviving children. If there are no surviving children and no the parents are still living, it's the parents. If the person had no children. So if there are no children, no parents, it's siblings. If there's no siblings, then it's whoever else falls in after that. Aunts, uncles, cousins, whomever. So when it comes to funeral arrangements, it's always the legal next of kin. So if you have a situation where you got 10 children and, you got 5 of them that want them buried and you got 5 of them that want them cremated, they just split down the middle on what they want. Most of the time, what we have to do in a situation like that, where the family is feuding, either because again, if it's children, they have equal say so. Mm-hmm. Every child has equal say so. So what we normally have to do, I normally have to say, okay, if there can't be a consensus reached, we have to do what's called a 10-day hold on the remains. Then after that 10 days, anybody has the right to determine disposition after 10 days if they can't come to a consensus. Now, there are situations where, now for cremation, for example, what the law requires in North Carolina, there has to be the majority of surviving next of kin to agree for cremation, because they would all have to sign what's called the authorization for cremation form. So there has to be a majority of survivors that will have to be in agreement to authorize cremation. If they're not in agreement, again, 10-day hold. Now, there's the wild card. What trumps all of that is if someone, and it doesn't have to be the legal next of kin. It could be, the husband had a wife, but he had a girlfriend. I've had this happen. The husband had a wife, but he had a girlfriend. Well, guess what? He made the girlfriend his health care power of attorney. Anybody that has a health care power of attorney, and in that health care power of attorney, there is a provision where the health care power of attorney has the right to disposition. In other words, they have the right to determine how that person is going to be put away and their funeral arrangements. The girlfriend trumped everybody in that case. So if someone has a health care power of attorney, that trumps everything. There ain't nothing you can do with that. And I had a situation where the guy was married, but he had a girlfriend. The girlfriend was the health care power of attorney. She trumped the wife.
Sheesh.
I bet that was fun.
So in this
That was not
situation,
pretty.
so in this particular situation we're talking about, it doesn't matter who's paying, those rules still apply. So I could be paying, but for some reason, if my husband, okay. Wow.
Yep. And I had a situation a few months ago
Jeez.
where the children were the legal next of kin. The children were in charge. Okay. Children were in charge because they're the legal next of kin. But the mother was the one that was paying for it. Mm-hmm. Well, the children wanted this, but mama didn't want that. So I had to say, well, mama, legally, children in charge. Well, mama said, well, I ain't paying for it. What can you do? You got to, legally speaking, it has to go with what the children say. Even though children didn't have a dime. But they're the legal next of kin.
Wow.
So There are situations where I've had to bend towards some children that didn't have any money. But yet mama or grandma had the money. So mama and grandma felt like it should go their way when I'm like, nah, sir, you're not the legal next of kin.
Yeah. I've seen in times past where a particular member of the family is the beneficiary.
Yep.
And that person is at odds with everybody.
Yep. Yep.
And you know, I hear him saying, "No pay, no say."
Yeah.
That's and so
Yep.
so I have seen families become so divided, and some never speaking to one another, and some not attending a service. And
Yeah.
as a fact, I've seen services have to be held up because of people not coming to an agreement.
I've had to do that myself. I've had situations where the family come in to make arrangements, and you got that one sister, that one brother that's the beneficiary on the policy they want to use to pay for the funeral.
Uh-huh.
Well, that brother or sister say, well, that's my money. I ain't using it for no funeral. And guess what? They have the right to do that. They're the beneficiary. That's their right.
That's true.
So
That's
the
true.
rest of them over here mad because they won't sign it. I'm like, well, you can't make them sign it unless you go hold them at gunpoint, I guess. But you can't make them do it.
That's true. That's so
And
true.
so y'all gonna have to come in and ask, well, there ain't another way around it. No, there's nothing I can do.
And so in that situation too, that takes me back to, I think when you talk about that assignment, that person, you know, that whoever I guess owns that policy, whatever, would have been a good idea to specify that policy be used for that purpose. So to avoid, you know, that in
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So at the time of death, funeral home, you know, would be the first to, okay, it's assigned, so it's gonna pay the funeral expenses first. Then anything left will go to the beneficiary.
Right.
Okay.
But if it's at the time of death and you just got a beneficiary that's at odds with the family, they're not gonna sign any paperwork. I've seen that happen. I have seen that happen time and time again, and it's usually ugly.
Yeah.
Very ugly.
It is. It is.
Wow. Man, no, that's awesome. Very, very insightful conversation. Comical, but real life. Like this, as you guys have mentioned, like this can really destroy your family if you don't have this stuff, you know, pre-planned and prepared, because you know how people get when money is involved. It can be a sticky situation.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Most definitely.
Awesome.
Well,
All right.
if I may say,
Mhm.
I think one of the things our people need to be educated to is concerning the types of policies to take out.
Yeah.
And you hit it so well concerning the insurance policies and things, because in yesteryears, my grandmother and they had those little small nickel and dime policies, $2,000, $3,000, and thinking that that's enough to bury today. That's not enough to even walk into a funeral home today.
Apostle, you'd be surprised how many people will still walk in here, bring me a whole grocery bag full of policies from companies where the name has changed 2 or 3 times over. One for $200, one for $250, one for $500. And they ask me, well, you know, Mama had insurance. They bring me 3 policies totaling $1,000.
If that.
And expect to have a funeral with all the bells and whistles. I'm like, well, baby, that's not gonna get it.
Not now.
We're gonna have to have a little bit more than that.
That's right. That's right.
So, you know, it happens.
Yeah, and so this is why we educate our people concerning the very same things that you're teaching, and we have people to come out and to talk to people concerning this, and especially nowadays with so much happening among young people and young people, and it would be wise that everybody learn to have insurable people.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Awesome. Appreciate that. All right. Well, Mr. Cody, Brother Cody, we want to be respectful of your time. Are you still good? If someone has another question or two, or do you?
Mhm.
Okay,
Sure.
okay. I know you've had a long day, so so if anyone has another question or two, we'll give you a chance to ask that. Does anyone have any other questions? So Cody, while we're waiting, could you just could you touch on what made you uh incorporate your exit, like your signature exit that you
Oh yeah.
I'm just curious on where that came from,
I,
or what
I've
inspired
I've
that.
been I've been doing that for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. Um, I was inspired by it's actually it's a common custom in Eastern North Carolina and South. So it's actually
Mm,
quite common.
mm-hmm,
If you go to Eastern North Carolina and South, like on into South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and it's actually very, it's a Southern tradition.
mm.
So it's actually quite common in those areas.
Gotcha.
Hmm.
Oh, that's awesome. Good to know.
Hmm.
All right. And could you just touch on, before we leave, could you touch on your life insurance business? I believe you have some offerings. You mentioned that you uh offer that
Oh
type
yeah,
of service. So if you want to touch on that, just to provide the
yeah.
information.
I do write life insurance. I do, whole term, final expense and pre-need. So I do offer, different products depending on what the customer wants and what best fits their needs and their budget. So I do write life insurance. I normally try to tell people the best time for me, the best time to catch, if I can't do it, I have colleagues that I can definitely, that I work with, that I can refer you to. But the best time to catch me personally to do insurance is whenever I don't have a full house.
True.
So right now I got kind of a full house, so it's not the best
Hmm.
time for me. But if it's a week where it's more quiet, I have more flexibility. But even
Hmm.
if it's busy, I have colleagues that I work closely with that do the same thing that I could, pair you up with. That could, get you taken care of. But yeah, I do write life insurance as well.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for
Hmm.
that. Perfect. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. So, any last words that you want to leave us with, or any tips, or just anything that you want to provide? And then also, of course, plug your contact information so folks will know how to get in contact with you. And I'll post it in our group as well.
Sure. Well, I just want to thank you for allowing us the opportunity to come and share this information. I always enjoy sharing this information because I want people to be informed and to make wise decisions. As I always say, whether you use my establishment or any establishment, I want you to be informed and to make wise decisions. And of course, my contact information. Did you put it in the chat, or do I? You want me to do it?
Yeah, if you can drop it in the chat,
I'll put it in there.
and then what? Perfect. Let me see.
Yeah, I'll put that in there.
Perfect. And then
My contact.
I'll reshare it in our group, and I'll share it on Facebook as well and on our
Yeah.
page.
So yeah, I'll put my contact information in there. I'll put my phone number, office number, email address, and all of that,
Perfect.
and our website, McCainFuneralHome.com. I'll put
Mhm.
that in there as well. And
Excellent.
anytime, if you have any questions or concerns or would like some further information on anything related to what we've discussed, or maybe something that you didn't think to ask, that you thought of later, feel free to give me a call, email, or I'm on social media as well. So you can, send your questions or concerns that way.
All right. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Brother Cody. We appreciate it. Very, very, very thorough. We definitely have to have you back because a lot of more people need to have this information so we can
Sure.
stop seeing these GoFundMe's and fish fries.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. Love you all. Pray you have a blessed night, and we will talk to you guys later. All
Right.
right.
Thank you
Bye.
for having us.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.